Beneath the soil, and carved into mountainsides across Turkey, lie structures so ancient and so advanced that they force us to confront a simple, unsettling question. How did prehistoric people build any of this? At Göbekli Tepe, 11,000-year-old pillars rise with impossible precision. Deep below Cappadocia, entire underground cities twist through the earth. On remote summits, colossal stone heads watch over abandoned kingdoms. Who built these megastructures? What knowledge did they have? And why do so many of their stories end in silence? The deeper we dig, the stranger the past becomes. So what exactly are we missing? Göbekli Tepe. In the dry folds of southeastern Turkey, where wind-scoured hills drift into one another in muted ochre layers, Göbekli Tepe rises as a low, unassuming mound, whose quiet profile gives little hint of the depth of time sealed within it. Yet as excavation cuts into its surface, the ground opens onto a world far older than the first cities, revealing circular and oval enclosures anchored by pillars of pale limestone that stand in silent arcs, each weighing several tons and shaped with a precision that feels deliberate rather than ornamental. Their T-shaped tops, carved from single blocks, catch the slanting light in ways that soften their mass and emphasize the clean lines of their silhouette. And as archaeologists brush away the soil, the reliefs of animals, foxes mid-stride, cranes poised as if listening, snakes coiled with measured economy, begin to appear, offering a visual catalogue of a landscape long vanished, yet rendered with such familiarity that it suggests not fleeting encounters but accumulated knowledge. Within these stone circles, the two largest pillars often rise above the rest, facing each other as if marking a central axis of attention, their surfaces adorned with arms, hands, belts, and abstract forms that imply the stylized outline of beings rather than blank monoliths. And as the stratigraphy deepens, it becomes clear that the site was rebuilt multiple times across centuries, with older structures intentionally buried before new ones were raised. A pattern that introduces questions about memory, stewardship, and the rhythms of ritual life among communities, still moving across the land in small groups. Charcoal traces, flint fragments, and butchered animal bones fill the refuse of feasting that once took place here, but the absence of domestic architecture nearby suggests that gatherings may have been seasonal or episodic, tied to cycles we can only partially infer. And the sheer effort required to quarry, shape, and transport these pillars, some from nearly a kilometre away, invites ongoing discussion about the forms of cooperation that must have existed among societies traditionally characterized as simple or transient. Even the act of burying entire enclosures under thousands of tons of soil seems less like abandonment than a deliberate closing gesture, as though each precinct was concluded with care before another began. And while no clear iconographic key has been found to unlock the meaning of the carved creatures, their distribution across the pillars appears intentional, hinting at patterns of association or lineage that may have guided how space was experienced within the circles. Attempts to link the site to astronomical orientations have yielded intriguing alignments but also contradictions. For while some pillars appear to gesture towards celestial events, others refuse to form any coherent pattern, and the variability across different building phases complicates the idea of a single codified system. Likewise, interpretations that once framed the site as a purely ceremonial centre have gradually broadened as new excavations reveal stone benches, storage-like niches, and architectural refinements that suggest the boundaries between ritual and everyday practice may have been more fluid than earlier models assumed. The very age of the site, over 11,000 years, invites hypotheses about its role in the transition from mobile foraging to settled farming, with some researchers proposing that large communal projects like this helped knit disparate groups together and may have indirectly encouraged the cultivation of nearby wild grains, while others caution that the evidence remains incomplete and that social complexity need not follow agricultural innovation in such tidy sequence. Perhaps the most persistent mystery lies in the combination of artistry, labour, and continuity visible across so many building episodes. For the pillars hold not only images, but the subtle marks of tools, the faint channels where rain once ran, and the compacted floors where feet passed over the same surfaces again and again, leaving a palimpsest of presence that cannot be reduced to any single interpretation. And as each excavation square extends the known boundaries of the site, revealing yet more buried enclosures awaiting study, Göbekli Tepe continues to resist final definition, its carved stones rising from their soft bed of accumulated time, as though preserving the outline of a story whose beginning we can glimpse and whose end remains tucked beneath the hill, waiting in the quiet spaces between questions for the next layer of earth to lift. Karahan Tepe. In the sun-baked expanses of the Tek Mountains, where the ridges fall into long troughs of wind-polished stone, Karahan Tepe emerges from its sandstone cradle with a different kind of density, its architecture less defined by freestanding pillars and more by spaces carved directly into the bedrock, as if the landscape itself was shaped into a gathering place long before visible structures rose from it. And at the heart of its excavated chambers, a sunken room lined with upright pillars creates an atmosphere both intimate and austere, their slender forms crowding together in a forest of stone that draws the eye toward the enigmatic human head carved in high relief at one end, its smooth contours lit by narrow shafts of daylight that descend through a circular opening above. Along the perimeter, carved channels trace geometric paths whose function remains uncertain, intersecting with low benches and recessed niches that hint at repeated use. And as archaeologists follow these carved features deeper, they uncover additional rooms, some filled with T-shaped pillars, similar to those at Göbekli Tepe, but smaller and arranged in tighter compositions, suggesting shared traditions refracted through local adaptation. Scattered flint tools, animal bones, and fragments of worked stone lie in the fill layers that accumulated after the chambers were abandoned. And while the chronology places Karahan Tepe within the same early Neolithic horizon as its more widely known counterpart, its emphasis on subterranean space raises questions about how different communities within the same cultural constellation negotiated ideas of enclosure, visibility, and ritual performance. One chamber contains a series of elongated phallic columns whose meaning remains debated, for while some see them as symbolic markers of fertility or regeneration, others propose more utilitarian explanations tied to the shaping of the bedrock or the acoustics of enclosed spaces. Yet none of these hypotheses fully accounts for their deliberate and rhythmic arrangement. The precise polishing on certain stone surfaces, even where no carvings appear, suggests attention to sensory experience as much as to symbolic expression. And the steep stairways leading into the earth imply a choreography of movement that may have shaped how participants entered, gathered, and ascended in ways now lost to time. Efforts to link Karahan Tepe to a broader network of contemporaneous sites across the region, sometimes referred to collectively as the Taş Tepeler, have revealed both similarities and contradictions. For while shared techniques in carving and pillar design point to cultural continuity, the diversity of architectural solutions across the sites complicates any notion of a single centralized tradition. Animal imagery appears here too, though often in more abstract or abbreviated forms, and the scarcity of large sculpted panels, like those at Göbekli Tepe, suggests a different visual emphasis, perhaps one grounded in the play of light inside constricted spaces rather than in open courts. Radiocarbon dates cluster around the late 10th millennium BCE, reinforcing the impression of long-term occupation, or at least repeated visitation, but the absence of permanent domestic structures in the immediate vicinity leaves open the question of who built these chambers and how often they returned. As researchers extend trenches across the mound, additional bedrock-cut features come to light: channels, alignments, shallow basins, each adding to the site's architectural vocabulary, while also complicating attempts to define its principal function, and the interplay between built stone, carved voids, and natural topography suggests a design strategy attuned to both material and terrain. Among the most debated elements is the carved human head set into the wall of the central chamber, its expressionless face and smooth finish contrasting with the rougher textures around it. And while interpretations range from ancestor representation to symbolic guardian, none rest on firm evidence, leaving the sculpture suspended between functional object and emblem of a larger, unexplained intention. Water, too, may have played a role, for traces of runoff patterns and the shaping of certain channels indicate an awareness of seasonal flows, though whether this was practical, symbolic, or both remains uncertain. And as excavation seasons reveal ever more interlocking spaces, Karahan Tepe presents a portrait of a community experimenting with form and subterranean depth at a scale unusual for its era. Its carved chambers holding the cool shadows of a time when architecture, landscape, and gathering merged into a single continuum, leaving behind a sequence of spaces that whisper of a tradition both related to and distinct from the great stone circles of nearby hills, a tradition whose logic flickers at the threshold of interpretation and then retreats, preserving just enough ambiguity for the site to remain poised between knowledge and the stillness of unanswered questions. Hattusa. In the high tablelands of central Anatolia, where ridges of weathered rock frame a landscape shaped by slow geological uplift and winter winds, sweep across open valleys with a steady, toneless force. The ruins of Hattusa rise from a series of natural terraces that once held the capital of the Hittite Empire, its fortifications tracing long arcs across the hills, in courses of Cyclopean stone, whose scale and precision still anchor the city's outline against the surrounding quiet. And among its many gates, the Lion Gate and the Sphinx Gate stand as the most evocative thresholds, their carved guardians positioned at points where processional routes once bent toward the heart of the city. The Lion Gate, set into the southwest wall, presents paired lions carved in high relief from massive blocks of andesite, their open jaws and forward-set shoulders giving them an alertness that feels more architectural than aggressive. And as sunlight glances across their weathered surfaces, the subtle tooling marks left by Bronze Age masons come into focus, hinting at the layered effort behind their construction. Beyond this gate, the ancient roadway leads upward along the slope toward the upper city, where temples, administrative buildings and storerooms once occupied a dense and carefully structured urban plan. While to the east, the Sphinx Gate crowns the walls of the upper citadel, its paired sphinxes flanking a narrow passage that would have controlled entry to the most elevated precincts, their bodies carved with a stylized precision that contrasts with the more robust forms of the lions below, suggesting different workshops or symbolic functions within the larger iconographic program of the city. Excavations reveal that these gates were not merely decorative, but integral components of a fortification system that combined massive stone foundations with mud brick superstructures, forming defensive layers that encircled an urban area extending over several square kilometres. Yet the city's defensive strength sits alongside evidence of complex administrative life, from tablet archives recording treaties, inventories and religious rituals, to storage chambers where large pithoi once held grain and other staples essential to palace and temple economies. The stratigraphy shows repeated phases of building, destruction and reconstruction, each reflecting political shifts and pressures from surrounding regions, and the city's ultimate abandonment around the early 12th century BCE remains linked to a broader pattern of regional instability, whose mechanisms, whether drought, conflict, internal disruption, or multiple overlapping causes remain under debate. Within this broader context, the monumental gates function not only as physical thresholds, but as markers of ceremonial and political identity. They're sculpted creatures echoing iconographic themes found across the Hittite world, while also reflecting localized artistic choices that speak to the city's status as an imperial center. The lions, with their forward-facing posture, belong to a tradition of protective figures that appear throughout Hittite architecture. Yet their placement at one of the main entrances suggests a deeper role in shaping how visitors experience the city. While the sphinxes, thought to have originally incorporated heads, carved separately and attached to the main bodies, hint at craft techniques that balanced modular construction with sculptural detail. Inscriptions and relief fragments found elsewhere in Hattusa provide glimpses of a ritual landscape in which processions likely moved between temples, gates, and open courtyards, and the alignment of certain architectural features with natural rock outcrops and elevated terraces suggests that the city's designers were attentive to the topography, using the natural contours to structure both movement and sightlines. The nearby sanctuary of Yazılıkaya, with its carved rock chambers filled with processions of deities, adds another dimension to the ceremonial life of the capital. And while its connection to the gates is not direct, the shared artistic motifs and spatial logic reinforce the idea of a coherent ideological world, shaped by both architecture and landscape. Yet contradictions arise when attempting to read the gates as fixed symbols. For while their monumental forms suggest permanence, the archaeological record shows episodes of rebuilding that altered their appearance over time, and the incomplete preservation of their upper elements leaves open questions about how they originally functioned visually and structurally within the city walls. Archaeologists debate whether their iconography primarily signalled divine protection, royal authority, or territorial identity, and the lack of contemporary textual. References to the gates themselves limits the confidence with which any single interpretation can be applied. Even the order in which travellers encountered the sculpted figures, whether during processions, diplomatic arrivals, or daily movement, remains only partially reconstructible, for paths have shifted and later modifications obscure the original approach patterns. As the modern visitor stands before the gates, the spaces beyond and behind them hold layers of vanished activity. Merchants passing through with goods from across Anatolia, scribes moving between administrative quarters, priests ascending toward the citadel, and guards watching from atop the battlements, where mud brick walls once heightened the stone foundations, now exposed to the sky. The lions and sphinxes, worn by centuries of weathering, convey neither triumph nor threat, but a muted sense of endurance, their forms bridging the gap between an imperial past and the dispersed fragments through which it must now be understood. And as the city walls trace their long courses across the hillsides, enclosing empty terraces once filled with buildings, now reduced to stone outlines, Hattusa's monumental gates remain focal points for reflection on how a major Bronze Age capital shaped its identity through architecture, and how these carved guardians, standing at thresholds where daily life once flowed in steady rhythms, continue to hold the quiet ambiguity of symbols, whose meanings were clear to those who passed between them, but now linger only as suggestions carried in their stillness. Suspended between the precision of archaeology and the open space of questions time has left behind. Mount Nemrut. High on the remote crest of the Taurus Mountains, where the air thins and the horizon stretches in pale, layered distances, Mount Nemrut rises as a solitary peak, transformed by human intention into a monumental terrace of stone, its summit reshaped in the 1st century BCE by King Antiochus I of Commagene into a ceremonial landscape that merges natural elevation with deliberate engineering, beginning with an immense gravel tumulus whose conical form looms above parallel terraces lined with colossal seated figures carved from local limestone. their once intact bodies now separated from the great heads that lie scattered across the slopes, like fragments arranged by time rather than design. Approaching the eastern terrace, the first light of day reveals the subtle textures of these weathered faces. Row upon row of Hellenistic and Persian-influenced deities, a syncretic pantheon reflecting the kingdom's position between cultural spheres, their expressions softened by centuries of frost and thaw, while the thrones behind them remain anchored in precise alignments that suggest a sustained engagement with celestial cycles, though the exact correspondences continue to invite debate among archaeologists and archaeoastronomers alike. Behind the statues, the retaining walls curve gently, forming a broad stage where votive practices may have unfolded, and the fragments of inscribed stelae offer glimpses into Antiochus's vision of a dynastic cult that fused his lineage with divine ancestry. Yet these inscriptions, though extensive, leave gaps where key details have eroded, creating space for questions about how often rituals were performed and how many participants the remote mountain could realistically support. On the western terrace, the afternoon light casts longer shadows over statues of similar composition, but arranged in a mirrored program, reinforcing the sense of deliberate duality embedded in the site's design, and the presence of relief panels depicting processional scenes, now broken, scattered, or partially rehabilitated, suggests a narrative sequence intended to be read in a specific order, though the interruption of many panels complicates attempts to reconstruct it with certainty. The engineering of the tumulus itself, composed of countless small stones forming a massive artificial cone, prevents excavation without destabilizing the structure, leaving the question of whether Antiochus truly placed a tomb chamber within its depths unresolved. And while geophysical surveys have identified anomalies that might indicate internal features, none have yielded definitive proof of burial architecture, creating a tension between textual claims of monumental interment and the physical inaccessibility of the mound. The site's position, over 2,000 metres above sea level, raises practical considerations about construction logistics, for hauling enormous stone blocks up the steep, narrow track that leads to the summit would have required coordinated labour and seasonal planning. Yet the absence of detailed quarrying remains near the top leaves aspects of the building process unclear, including whether some elements were shaped below and transported upward or carved directly on site. Traces of pathways, terraces, and ancillary structures around the summit hint at a broader ceremonial complex, though erosion and seismic activity have obscured many features, leaving archaeologists to piece together fragmentary evidence of architectural elements whose functions cannot be securely determined. The syncretic imagery, Greek-style facial features combined with Persian headdresses, eagles flanking lions, deities linked across cultural traditions, suggests a political strategy of unifying diverse populations under a shared symbolic order. Yet the mountain's isolation tempers this interpretation, raising the possibility that the summit served more as a dynastic pilgrimage centre than a space for regular public gatherings. Even the famous alignment of the colossal heads, often photographed in dramatic light, may not reflect their original positions, since earthquakes have shifted and toppled many pieces, and early excavations did not always document their initial placements with precision, introducing uncertainty into reconstructions of the terrace's intended visual impact. Inscriptions known as the Nomos of Antiochus describe complex rites and calendrical observances, but the absence of physical installations corresponding to all the rituals listed suggests that some may have taken place elsewhere in the kingdom, or that certain features remain undiscovered beneath collapsed stone. Scholars debate whether the terraces were designed for astronomical observation, with arguments pointing to solstitial alignments, yet the variability introduced by later disturbances and the incomplete survival of structural markers complicate attempts to draw firm conclusions, creating a rare instance where textual ambition and physical evidence overlap only partially. Seasonal variations shape the site's modern presence as well. For in winter, snow packs tightly against the statues, softening their outlines until only the broadest features remain visible, while in summer, the harsh mountain light exposes every fracture, making the breakage patterns themselves part of the monument's current form, a reminder of the site's long exposure to extreme conditions. Scattered around the terraces, fragments of altars, bases, and structural blocks combine to suggest that Mount Nemrut once formed the centerpiece of a broader sacred geography, linking nearby outposts such as Arsamaya, where additional inscriptions detail Antiochus's ideological program. Yet even with these connections, the summit retains an enigmatic quality, for little evidence remains of the daily practices of the people who might have ascended to take part in its ceremonies. The heads themselves, monumental yet introspective in their repose, convey neither triumph nor loss, but a kind of detached endurance. Their fallen state neither fully ruinous nor intact, caught between the order originally imposed upon the mountain and the slow transformations wrought by time, and as each layer of research adds new dimensions, while leaving older uncertainties unresolved, Mount Nemrut persists as a high-altitude archive of ambition and belief, a place where engineered stone meets immense sky, where inscriptions reach for clarity yet fall short of final explanation, and where the mountain's own shape, reshaped by human hands yet still subject to natural forces, holds a silence that deepens with every unanswered question, maintaining the equilibrium between what is known and what remains quietly withheld within the stony heart of the summit. Derinkuyu. Beneath the volcanic plains of Cappadocia, where soft, tough cliffs rise in muted folds and valleys curve into labyrinths carved by wind and water, the underground city of Derinkuyu descends through the earth in a series of widening chambers and narrowing corridors, whose arrangement suggests both careful planning and long-term adaptation, beginning with a broad entrance hall that once led travellers downward through sloping passages into a world where light faded gradually into the cool, steady darkness of the deeper levels. As excavators traced these passages through layers of sediment and fallen debris, they found a complex of rooms, kitchens blackened by ancient soot, wine presses carved into the bedrock, storage cellars arranged in clustered niches, and ventilation shafts rising in narrow cylinders toward the distant surface. Each element positioned with a deliberate sense of spatial economy that balanced circulation, stability, and the practicalities of life underground. The great millstone doors, carved from dense basalt, and set into grooves so they could roll shut to seal narrow passages, stand among the most distinctive features, their size suggesting significant defensive forethought. Yet the absence of clear historical records from the earliest phases of the city leaves uncertain when precisely these mechanisms were first installed and whether they served more as deterrents during brief emergencies or formed part of a broader refuge system used over extended periods. Radiocarbon evidence and associated material culture point to occupation at least as early as the early 1st millennium BCE, possibly with antecedents in earlier Phrygian or late Bronze Age, modifications of natural cavities, though the precise sequence remains debated due to the difficulty of dating carved voids where organic material is sparse. Across its 8 principal levels, descending more than 50 metres, the city maintains a rhythm of open chambers interwoven with tight, angled corridors, designed to slow movement and divide the underground population into manageable zones, while shared wells and a sophisticated ventilation network suggest an infrastructure capable of supporting large groups for sustained intervals, although estimates of the population size vary widely due to uncertainties about how many adjacent complexes may have connected to Derinkuyu during its peak periods of use. Certain architectural details, such as communal spaces with low platforms possibly used for instruction or worship, hint at the presence of organized social structures, Yet the absence of inscriptions or durable iconography makes it difficult to determine how roles were distributed or how decisions were coordinated among the inhabitants. Comparisons with nearby underground networks at Kaymaklı, Özkonak, and Mars reveal both commonalities and differences. Similar defensive features and storage arrangements appear throughout the region, while variations in depth, room shape, and interlevel connectivity indicate that each community developed its subterranean architecture in response to local needs and geological constraints, complicating efforts to view these cities as part of a single unified system. The upper levels of Derinkuyu appear more domestic, with evidence of routine subsistence activities, while the deeper levels carry fewer traces of daily life, raising questions about whether the lowest chambers served specialized purposes such as temporary refuge, resource storage, or ritual gatherings, though none of these interpretations can be confirmed with certainty. Historical records from later periods suggest that communities throughout Cappadocia used underground spaces during episodes of conflict. Yet the archaeological evidence shows multiple phases of expansion and modification, implying that the city's function changed over time rather than adhering to a single stable role. Even the city's relationship to the surface settlements remains partly obscure, for while remnants of above-ground structures have been documented, their chronological and functional connections to the underground levels remain difficult to reconstruct due to erosion and later building phases that have erased much of the early landscape. Attempts to trace the airflow through the ventilation shafts reveal a sophisticated understanding of cave microclimates, with shafts positioned to exploit natural convection currents. Yet the full extent of this network remains only partially mapped, especially where collapses or sediment fills obstruct deeper passages. Corridors linking Derinkuyu to adjacent subterranean areas, reported in local traditions, have been only partially confirmed, with some stretches showing evidence of deliberate blockage, perhaps reflecting shifting political or environmental pressures that altered the need for inter-settlement connectivity. Volcanic eruptions, long predating human occupation, produced the region's unique tuff formations, and the stone's softness allowed for incremental modification. Rooms expanded, corridors redirected, traps and gates installed. Yet this same softness leaves the archaeological record vulnerable to collapse and loss, creating gaps that affect efforts to reconstruct the earliest phases of the city's development. Although medieval and later inhabitants reused many of the existing spaces, identifying distinct phases remains difficult without stratified deposits, and the few datable artifacts imply episodic rather than continuous occupation, suggesting that Derinkuyu served more as an adaptable refuge and storage complex than as a permanently inhabited environment. Standing in its deep stairwells, where worn steps descend into a narrowing darkness, relieved only by scattered lantern recesses, one senses the cumulative labour embedded in the walls. Each chisel mark representing decisions shaped by necessity, opportunity, or the evolving rhythms of the surrounding communities. Yet despite the extent of its mapped corridors, questions linger about its earliest inhabitants, their motives for building downward rather than outward, and the degree to which surface events shaped the choices made in the subterranean realm, leaving Derinkuyu suspended between the clarity of its carved architecture and the quiet uncertainties of a history preserved largely through absences, where each descending level reveals not a definitive narrative, but a deepening space of possibilities hollowed into the earth over centuries of adaptation and change. Ani ruins. On a high plateau overlooking the Akurian River, where the borderlands between rolling grasslands and volcanic foothills form a landscape marked by long horizons and intermittent ravines, the ruins of Ani stretch across a series of ridges and shallow gullies, their surviving walls and fractured silhouettes hinting at the scale of a medieval city once known for its wealth, craftsmanship, and strategic position along trade routes linking Anatolia, the Caucasus, and the Iranian plateau. From the moment one enters through the partially preserved ramparts, fortifications built in successive phases of basalt and tuff, each layer reflecting different centuries of maintenance and conflict. The city's fragmented architecture emerges in sequences of churches, palaces, merchant houses, and civic structures whose varying states of preservation reveal both the ambition of their builders and the long processes of abandonment, erosion, and seismic disturbance that transformed the city into the open-air archive it is today. The Cathedral of Ani, designed by the architect Tredat in the late 10th century, anchors the central ridge with its tall, pointed arcades and broad interior space. Its volcanic stone blocks, fitted with a precision that becomes clearer as light moves across the walls. Yet even here, the absence of the original dome introduces uncertainty into how the interior once handled sound and illumination, and the distribution of fallen architectural fragments around the building complicates efforts to reconstruct its exact profile. Nearby, the Church of the Redeemer, split cleanly in half by a later collapse, reveals an interior section frozen like a geological cross-section, its fresco traces and slender columns still visible along the surviving semicircle, while the Church of St. Gregory of the Abugam Rents, with its tall drum and ornate blind arcading, stands in comparatively stable condition, offering a sense of the city's architectural vocabulary, even as questions remain about the extent to which decorative programs varied across different patronage networks. The Citadel, perched on the highest ridge overlooking the river, preserves foundations of earlier structures, some potentially dating to pre-medieval phases, though the superposition of later fortifications and the heavy erosion of the summit make it difficult to distinguish which walls correspond to which dynastic periods, leaving the site's earliest chapters only partially retrievable from the surviving masonry. Residential quarters extend across the slopes in scattered clusters, their walls often reduced to low outlines, and while the distribution of hearths, storage pits and collapsed cellar vaults suggests a dense urban fabric during the city's peak, the absence of intact upper stories limits interpretations of household organisation and social stratification. Excavations have uncovered evidence of metalworking, pottery production and textile dyeing, but the spatial separation between industrial areas and residential sectors is not always clear, and debris fields mixed across multiple layers indicate episodes of destruction, whether from conflict, fire, or earthquake, that compress the city's occupational history into complex palimpsests. Along the outer edges, the remains of caravanserais and merchant houses hint at Ani's role as a trade hub, yet incomplete road surfaces and missing gates complicate efforts to map the precise flow of goods through the city, while the extensive cave dwellings carved into the cliffs below the citadel suggest a mixed urban ecology in which surface architecture and subterranean habitation coexisted, though the chronological relationship between the cave complexes and the walled city remains uncertain due to limited excavation in those areas. Inscriptions in Armenian script found on lintels and carved stones provide glimpses into patronage, repair work, and devotional practices, but many are fragmentary, their contexts disrupted by later collapses or salvage activities, leaving only partial records of the city's administrative and religious life. The city's decline, often attributed to a sequence of invasions, trade route shifts, and seismic events, is not straightforwardly reflected in the archaeological record. For some quarters show signs of prolonged occupation, while others were abandoned earlier, suggesting that depopulation occurred unevenly rather than as a single sudden event. The city's stone masonry, notable for its alternating courses of dark basalt and reddish tuff, reacts differently to weathering, and these variations create inconsistencies in preservation that obscure architectural details such as window tracery, decorative mouldings and roofing systems, complicating attempts to reconstruct the skyline that once distinguished Ani at its height. The defensive walls, though monumental in extent, show multiple points where earlier alignments were modified or expanded, raising questions about whether these changes reflected shifts in military technology, demographic pressure, or administrative priorities. And the lack of continuous written records from the city itself means that chronological assignments often rely on stylistic comparison rather than direct evidence. Within the broader landscape, the city's relationship to surrounding agricultural lands, satellite villages, and river crossings remains only partly understood. For while irrigation channels and road traces have been documented, their dates and connections to specific phases of the city's development are difficult to establish, leaving open the question of how Ani balanced its urban population with the capacities of its hinterland. Yet despite these uncertainties, the scattered vaults, half-standing apses, fractured domes, and broken arcades retain a coherence grounded in the quality of their stonework and the persistence of their spatial logic, hinting at a city that once thrived on the convergence of trade, craftsmanship, and religious devotion, even as the subsequent centuries transformed its dense urban rhythms into a landscape of isolated monuments. And as the wind moves through its empty churches and along the irregular outlines of former avenues, Ani's ruins preserve a quiet register of both presence and absence, offering a fragmentary but enduring testament to a city whose architectural achievements remain legible, even as the full shape of its social and economic life continues to elude complete reconstruction, held in the spaces where stone endures, while the narratives once carried within it have thinned into the silences of the plateau. Çatalhöyük. Across the Konya Plain, where the horizon settles into long horizontal bands of pale earth and sky, the tell of Çatalhöyük rises as a broad, low mound, whose deceptively simple profile conceals one of the most intricate early urban landscapes known from the Neolithic. Its densely packed houses built wall to wall without intervening streets, creating a continuous architectural fabric entered through roof openings that once formed the primary thresholds between interior and exterior life. As excavations peel back the tightly layered superstructure, they reveal sequences of plastered walls, repeatedly renewed across generations, their surfaces bearing red ochre paintings of geometric patterns, wild cattle, vultures, and schematic human forms, imagery whose shifting emphasis raises questions about whether these motifs reflected communal rites, household memory, or more situational expressions tied to specific events within the settlement. Beneath the floors, burials arranged in flexed positions, sometimes accompanied by beads or tools, anchor the living spaces to cycles of ancestry and remembrance, and the accumulation of such interments within domestic rooms suggests a social framework that wove ritual and domestic life into a single continuum, even as the absence of clear public architecture complicates attempts to identify centralized authority or formal communal institutions. The settlement's growth over centuries produced an increasingly labyrinthine layout, with houses rebuilt on the footprints of their predecessors, creating stratified levels where subtle shifts in building orientation and room configuration mark gradual changes in spatial organization. Yet the overall continuity of design points to stable traditions of construction and shared understandings of how households should be arranged. Excavated artifacts, obsidian tools traded from volcanic sources to the east, clay figurines varying from highly stylized to more naturalistic forms, ground stone axes and domestic vessels provide glimpses into daily practices and external connections, though the variability in figurine distribution across houses challenges earlier interpretations that framed them as universal cult objects, suggesting instead a more diverse range of household activities and symbolic expressions. Food remains, including charred grains, animal bones, and botanical impressions in plaster, show that inhabitants cultivated wheat and barley while continuing to hunt wild cattle and deer, blending agricultural and foraging strategies in ways that defy simple categorization, and the presence of specialized spaces for storing and processing food. such as raised platforms, bins, and hearth arrangements, points to an internal household organisation where tasks were divided among distinct zones, now observable only through their spatial residues. The absence of streets required movement across rooftops, creating an elevated circulation system that likely influenced social interaction patterns, though the lack of written records from the period leaves uncertain how households coordinated access, navigation, or shared responsibilities across the dense settlement. Excavators have identified certain buildings with more elaborate plaster reliefs, including bullhorn installations and raised platforms interpreted as ritual or commemorative spaces. Yet these buildings do not exhibit consistent features across the settlement, introducing caution into efforts to classify them as formal shrines or exclude alternative domestic explanations. Fire incidents preserved within the archaeological strata reveal episodes of rapid abandonment and reconstruction. Yet the causes, whether accidental, environmental, or tied to community-level events, remain uncertain, and the varying intensity of burning across structures suggests that not all households experience these episodes uniformly. The Tell's long occupational sequence spans over a millennium, and transition between its east and west mounds marks shifts in settlement density and organisation whose triggers remain debated, with possibilities ranging from resource depletion to social reorganisation or climatic variation, though none of these can be confirmed definitively. Microscopic analysis of plaster floors shows repeated refinishing, sometimes dozens of times within a single occupation phase, implying a continuity of domestic maintenance practices that formed part of the rhythm of everyday life. While the distinctive practice of removing certain objects during house closure events, such as particular plaster features or installations, suggests ritualized abandonment that preserved aspects of household identity even as structures were sealed beneath new construction. Contradictions emerge when comparing the density of occupation with the relatively modest scale of agricultural facilities, raising questions about how the settlement sustained itself during periods of peak population, and whether external networks of exchange or intermittent mobility played a greater role than the static archaeological record alone can display. Environmental samples indicate fluctuations in local hydrology and vegetation, yet these shifts do not align neatly with major occupational transitions, underscoring the complexity of factors that shaped the settlement's longevity. Through its tangled layers, Çatalhöyük presents a community in which private and communal spheres seem intertwined without clear architectural boundaries, a place where memory accumulated not in monuments or public plazas, but within the cyclical renewal of domestic spaces and the quiet layering of plaster, burial and debris. And as excavations continue to refine the site's intricate sequence, the settlement remains suspended between what its architecture reveals and what its missing archives cannot supply, offering a portrait of early urban life defined as much by the enduring patterns of its households as by the unanswered questions that linger in the thick stratigraphy of its walls, floors, and the silent spaces left between them. Van Fortress. Above the northern shore of Lake Van, where steep cliffs rise in pale volcanic layers and the wind carries an intermittent scent of salt and stone, the Van Fortress, also known as the Citadel of ancient Tushpa, stands along a long limestone ridge that once formed the political and ceremonial heart of the Urartian kingdom. Its massive walls and rock-cut chambers tracing a silhouette that aligns with the jagged spine of the promontory, creating an interplay between natural escarpment and constructed fortification that is still visible in the shifting light of the plateau. As one follows the narrow approach, paths that wind upward from the lakefront, the scale of the citadel becomes clearer in the way stepped terraces, once filled with administrative buildings and storerooms, ascend toward a sequence of rock-cut inscriptions carved deeply into the cliff face, their cuneiform lines detailing royal campaigns, irrigation projects, and dedicatory statements that map both the ambitions and anxieties of a kingdom positioned between the great powers of the early Iron Age. Yet the erosion of certain panels, some worn nearly smooth, leaves isolated phrases that hint at events now only faintly recoverable. The outer fortifications, built of carefully fitted basalt blocks at the lower levels and lighter limestone above, follow the contours of the ridge enclosing elongated courtyards whose functions are inferred from their layouts and associated finds. But the lack of extensive domestic remains within the citadel suggests that its primary role lay in governance, ritual, and storage rather than continuous civilian habitation. Archaeological excavations on the middle terraces have uncovered the foundations of granaries and workshops, their thick stone walls indicating a concern with both security and temperature regulation, while nearby cisterns carved into the bedrock imply efforts to manage water supply in a region prone to seasonal fluctuations, though the exact mechanisms by which water was lifted or distributed remain uncertain due to the absence of preserved installations. The famous Analemur inscription of King Sarduri I, cut into a vertical face near the western entrance, proclaims the founding of Tushpa as the royal seat. Yet the discrepancy between textual assertions of stability and the archaeological evidence for multiple building phases, some interrupting earlier structures, others reinforcing them, suggests a more dynamic history of adaptation, expansion, and response to shifting political pressures. Inside the citadel, rock-cut chambers with smoothed interiors and recessed niches are interpreted as storerooms or ritual spaces, but the lack of organic residues or diagnostic artifacts complicates attempts to refine these identifications, and the presence of later modifications from medieval and Ottoman periods further blurs the boundaries between phases. Nearby, the so-called Menua Canal, an extensive irrigation system attributed to King Menua, stretches across kilometres of countryside, demonstrating the engineering capabilities of the Urartians and their reliance on managed water networks to support agriculture and settlement around the lake, though the exact relationship between the fortress administrators and the communities who maintained these canals remains a matter of debate. At the summit of the ridge, the remains of a temple platform offer a vantage over the lake and surrounding plain, its cut stone foundation blocks forming a nearly rectangular footprint that once supported a structure dedicated to the chief Urartian deity, Haldi. Yet the limited architectural fragments surviving above the foundation leave ambiguous whether the temple matched the more elaborate stone and mud brick designs attested at other Urartian sites, or whether it followed a locally distinct plan. Pottery assemblages recovered from the fortress slopes, a mix of fine painted wares, large storage jars and utilitarian vessels, provide chronological anchors, though their dispersion across collapsed terraces introduces interpretive challenges, as post-abandonment erosion may have relocated materials far from their original contexts. The city of ancient Tushpa, which spread across the plain below the citadel, is known only fragmentarily due to later construction overlaying much of its extent, and the lack of deep, continuous excavation in the lower town leaves uncertain how the administrative functions of the fortress were integrated with daily life on the plain. Fragments of iron weaponry and bronze fittings indicate military presence, yet the absence of barracks-like structures on the upper terraces suggests that garrisons may have been stationed in the lower town or nearby settlements rather than within the citadel proper, complicating earlier. Assumptions about the fortress as a purely martial centre. Contradictory interpretations arise when reconstructing the rhythms of life atop the ridge, while the monumental inscriptions and scale of defensive works imply a constant assertion of royal authority. The scarcity of large architectural complexes on the summit raises the possibility that ceremonial activities took place only intermittently, with the fortress serving as a symbolic and administrative anchor rather than a densely occupied stronghold. Geological studies of the limestone ridge show that natural fissures influence the placement of certain construction phases, and the Urartian builders appear to have incorporated these features into their defensive design. Yet the degree to which this was strategic or simply pragmatic remains open given the limited documentation of construction sequences. Later, Armenian, medieval and Ottoman additions, ranging from small chapels to defensive towers, create a multi-layered architectural palimpsest that both enriches and obscures the original Urartian layout, and distinguishing between these phases requires careful analysis of masonry style, mortar composition and stratigraphic association, though even with these tools, some areas remain ambiguous. The vantage from the highest terraces, where the lake stretches in shifting shades of blue and grey, underscores why the ridge was chosen. It offered visibility across routes entering the Highlands and a commanding position over the fertile strip along the lakeshore. Yet visibility does not fully explain the symbolic weight expressed in the inscriptions, which tie the citadel's identity to divine sanction and royal lineage rather than to its defensive advantages alone. In this blend of strategic position, administrative complexity, and partial preservation, Van Fortress stands as both a keystone of Urartian statecraft and an incomplete archive, its cuneiform declarations of stability juxtaposed with architectural evidence of change, adaptation, and occasional rupture. And as one moves along the terraces where walls end abruptly or passages fade into eroded rock, the site retains an atmosphere shaped as much by what has vanished as by what remains, leaving its long history to be reconstructed from scattered fragments that gesture toward a narrative still held partly within the rugged contours of the ridge and the quiet expanse of the surrounding plain. Aphrodisias Stadium. South of the Meander Valley, where low hills fold into one another in muted tones of grey and pale green, the ancient city of Aphrodisias lies preserved in a landscape shaped by seismic shifts and slow agricultural cycles. And along its northern edge, the stadium stretches in a long elliptical arc that remains one of the best preserved examples of its kind, its rows of marble and limestone seating aligned in a gentle rise that follows the contour of a natural depression adapted by Roman planners into an arena capable of holding tens of thousands of spectators. Approaching from the east, the scale becomes apparent not merely in the length of the structure, over 260 metres from end to end, but in the subtle curvature of its seating tiers, each carved with a precision that speaks to careful surveying and a sensitivity to the terrain. And as excavation has cleared collapsed sections and accumulated soil, the entrances, vaults and substructures have emerged in patterns that hint at a complex choreography of movement once required to accommodate crowds during festivals and athletic competitions. The arena floor, long buried under silt and wind-blown sediment, reveals a surface of compacted earth that bears faint levelling marks, and its elongated shape suggests that foot races, ball games and perhaps equestrian events formed the core of the stadium's programme. Though the absence of extensive inscriptions or dedicated iconographic panels makes it difficult to reconstruct the full range of activities that unfolded there across the centuries. To the west, a later modification closes one end of the stadium with a series of arcaded walls and reoriented seating, features associated with the transformation of part of the arena into a venue for gladiatorial contests during the late Roman period. A shift that introduces questions about how the city adapted its public spaces to changing tastes and political pressures. For while the structural evidence supports this reinterpretation, the relative scarcity of associated artifacts complicates precise dating of these modifications. The marble quarries for which Aphrodisias is famed, visible in the hills beyond the city, likely supplied much of the stone used for seating blocks and architectural trim, and the presence of unfinished pieces and tool marks along certain tiers suggests that final adjustments were made on site, perhaps in response to evolving design decisions or to repair damage caused by seismic events that periodically reshaped the region. Inscriptions carved into select seats, indicating reserved places for civic officials or benefactors, hint at the layered social organisation within the audience. Yet these inscriptions occur sporadically and with varying degrees of legibility, making it difficult to determine how extensively the stadium's seating plan reflected status divisions or whether such distinctions shifted over time. The relationship between the stadium and the rest of the city emerges through the distribution of pathways leading from the agora, bath complexes, and theatre, revealing a network of routes that once funneled participants and spectators toward the venue during major festivals, though erosion and later agriculture have obscured many of these lines of movement, leaving archaeologists to infer much of the traffic patterns from fragmentary surfaces and scattered architectural blocks. The city's proximity to fault lines is evident in the displacement of certain seating rows, where minute shifts in block alignment trace the long-term effects of earthquakes, and while ancient repair efforts can be seen in patches of fresh masonry and reinserted blocks, these do not always correspond neatly to known historical events, raising questions about how frequently the stadium was restored, and how the local community prioritised such work amid broader civic obligations. Nearby, the Tetrapylon and the Sanctuary of Aphrodite speak to the city's religious and artistic vitality, yet the stadium's alignment does not appear to integrate directly with these monuments, suggesting that while the athletic and ceremonial functions of the city coexisted, they did not necessarily share a unified architectural plan, a conclusion reinforced by the slight divergence in their orientations. Soil analyses beneath the arena floor reveal traces of repeated levelling episodes, implying cycles of renewal that may reflect both maintenance and adaptation to changes in the types of events held there, though the absence of deep stratified deposits limits the precision with which these cycles can be dated. Scholars debate whether annual or semi-annual festivals anchored the stadium's busiest periods, but the lack of explicit textual records from Aphrodisias itself means that much of this. Discussion relies on indirect comparisons with other Greco-Roman cities, leaving open the possibility that local traditions shaped its use in ways not readily apparent from the surviving remains. Even the acoustic properties of the stadium, now difficult to reconstruct due to the loss of wooden seating elements and the altered contours of the upper tiers, introduce uncertainties about how sound travelled during events, especially when the structure was full, though the narrowness of the arena suggests a more intimate setting than the larger circuses of the empire, one in which the reactions of the crowd may have played a central role in the experience of competition. In the present state of preservation, where long stretches of seating remain intact while other areas show gaping interruptions from collapse or stone robbing, the stadium offers both clarity and obscurity. Clarity in the visible geometry of its form and the careful engineering embedded in its terraces. Obscurity in the absence of definitive evidence about how its functions evolved, how its crowds assembled and dispersed, and how the rhythms of public life moved between this vast arena and the more compact civic spaces surrounding it. And as the sun tracks across the length of the structure, casting alternating bands of light and shadow across the rows of stone, the stadium's monumental calm conveys the residue of countless events now distant, its open floor and silent tiers preserving a faint but persistent sense of the gatherings once held here, even as many details of their scale, purpose and atmosphere remain folded into the ambiguities of its weathered architecture and the broader, partly recoverable narrative of the city that sustained it. Ephesus, westward toward the Aegean coast, where the hills part into a broad corridor that once carried merchants, pilgrims, and imperial envoys between inland valleys and the shoreline. The ancient city of Ephesus unfolds in a long arc along the base of Mount Pion, and the former harbour plain, its streets, temples and civic structures revealing an urban landscape shaped by shifting coastlines, repeated rebuilding, and the layered ambitions of Greek, Roman and early Christian communities. Following the marble-paved Kuret Street downward from the upper agora, the city's architectural rhythm emerges in a sequence of colonnades, fountains and inscribed pedestals, each marking episodes of benefaction and civic pride. Yet the gradual slope of the street also reflects practical engineering choices responding to the natural grade of the hill, allowing runoff to be channeled through stone-lined conduits that still trace faint patterns beneath the broken slabs. Midway along this descent stands the Library of Celsus, its restored facade rising in tiers of columns, niches, and sculpted ornamentation that frame an interior space once dedicated to the memory of a Roman governor. Though the reconstructed facade, assembled from original fragments and carefully matched replacements, leaves unanswered questions about the precise configuration of the upper stories and the coloristic effects of its marble revetment before centuries of exposure dulled its surfaces. Adjacent structures, including the Gate of Mosaius and Mithridates, link the library to the commercial agora, where stores and shop fronts open onto a broad square that would once have thrummed with trade. Yet the fragmentary nature of its paving and the uneven distribution of architectural blocks complicate efforts to map the flow of economic life, particularly as later modifications obscured earlier phases. Continuing westward, the city's great theatre emerges in a sweeping semicircle carved into the hillside, its cavea ascending in broad arcs capable of seating tens of thousands, while the stage building's surviving niches and column bases hint at a once elaborate backdrop whose decorative programs have largely eroded, and the acoustic properties, still impressive in the surviving geometry, invite speculation about how performances, assemblies, and later public confrontations unfolded within this space. Though the absence of detailed records from Ephesus itself limits the ability to tie specific events to particular architectural configurations. Beyond the theatre, the Arcadian stretches toward what was once the harbour, its colonnaded sides framing a processional avenue that likely hosted imperial visits and ceremonial entries from arriving ships. Yet the harbour's gradual silting, well attested in sediment cores and ancient commentary alike, transformed this waterfront approach into an inland plain, prompting repeated efforts at dredging and canal construction whose success fluctuated across the centuries. The city's relocation of its commercial port functions further downstream reflects these environmental challenges, yet the archaeological traces of these adjustments remain fragmentary, as rising groundwater and later agricultural use obscure the stratigraphic sequence. The Temple of Artemis, once counted among the Seven Wonders, now survives only in scattered foundations and a single reconstructed column rising from marshy ground, a stark contrast to the descriptions left by ancient authors. And this gap between textual exuberance and archaeological sparsity highlights the difficulty of reconciling monumental accounts with the material residues of repeated destruction, reconstruction, and eventual neglect. Inscriptions from across the city record decrees, dedications, and civic honours, but their contexts have often shifted due to stone reuse in later building phases, complicating attempts to link them definitively to their original settings, and sometimes creating contradictions between stylistic dating and stratigraphic position. The terrace houses on the slopes of Mount Pion preserve intricate wall paintings, mosaic floors, and domestic installations that reveal the lives of affluent inhabitants, yet their preservation contrasts sharply with the more fragmentary remains of lower status dwellings elsewhere in the city, raising questions about how representative these elite spaces are for understanding broader social dynamics. Water management systems, clay pipes, lead conduits, and distribution basins form an intricate network across the city, but interruptions in their course and the absence of consistent gradients reveal phases of ad hoc repair and reconfiguration, suggesting a hydraulic landscape that evolved with changing urban needs rather than a single coherent plan. Seismic activity, documented in both architectural collapse layers and ancient reports, repeatedly reshaped Ephesus, and repair efforts varied widely across districts, resulting in uneven preservation that complicates efforts to reconstruct a unified urban timeline. The coexistence of pagan, Jewish, and early Christian communities is evident through scattered inscriptions and the proximity of religious structures. Yet the archaeological record leaves ambiguities about how these groups interacted in daily life, or how religious practices overlapped in shared spaces, especially during transitional periods of the late Roman and early Byzantine eras. Even the city's shifting shoreline poses unresolved questions about how closely its inhabitants monitored and managed sedimentation, for while dredging infrastructure is partially documented, the scale and frequency of maintenance remain unclear. Today, as visitors trace the long descent toward the former harbour plain, the visual sequence from Upper Agora to Library, from colonnaded street to theatre, retains an internal coherence that belies the city's long history of adaptation and reconstruction, its monuments simultaneously revealing and obscuring the forces that shaped them. And in the quiet intervals between these structures, where foundations shift abruptly, where stairways end without their upper stories, where drainage channels disappear under later paving, the city's layered past remains partly inaccessible, offering glimpses of an urban world whose detail exceeds what the surviving stones can fully disclose, leaving Ephesus poised between the clarity of its monumental remains and the open questions embedded in the slow transformations of its landscape and civic life. Midas City. Northwest of the Phrygian Highlands, where steep limestone ridges break into a labyrinth of shallow valleys and wind-scoured plateaus, the site known as Midas City, Yazılıkaya, rises in a stark outcrop whose sheer rock faces bear monumental inscriptions and carved facades that once anchored a ceremonial landscape at the heart of the Phrygian realm. Its most striking feature, the so-called Midas Monument, a towering relief facade cut directly into the cliff, with a geometric lattice of recessed panels that emulate wooden architecture in stone, framed by an inset niche, whose purpose remains debated due to the absence of surviving votive installations or unambiguous cultic markers. As the sun shifts across the face of the monument, the precision of its incised patterns becomes clearer, though weathering has softened many edges, and the prominent inscription invoking Midas, written in Phrygian script, sits high above the niche, offering a rare textual anchor for the site's symbolic associations, even as the interpretation of its dedicatee and function remains open, for the inscription does not explicitly explain the nature of the rites performed there or the extent to which the monument served as a focal point for regional pilgrimage. Beyond the facade, the landscape opens into a plateau scattered with chambers, rock-cut stairways, cisterns, and shallow altars carved into exposed bedrock. Features that indicate sustained ritual or administrative activity, but whose chronological sequence is difficult to establish due to the scarcity of datable material within carved spaces. Some chambers show smoothed interiors and bench-like platforms, while others contain rougher surfaces that suggest either incomplete construction or later reuse. And the distribution of these features across the plateau implies a dispersed spatial organization rather than a single centralized complex, raising questions about how different parts of the site were accessed and whether specific pathways structured movement across the rocky terrain. Above the Midas Monument, a series of interconnected terraces offer views across the surrounding hills, and traces of fortification walls, now heavily eroded, hint at defensive considerations or symbolic enclosure, though the limited preservation prevents a detailed reconstruction of their original extent or design. pottery fragments found in sheltered pockets suggest occupation or visitation across multiple periods, including Phrygian, Hellenistic, and Roman eras. Yet the thinness of these deposits and their dispersed distribution make it difficult to determine whether the site maintained a continuous ritual function or experienced episodic reuse shaped by shifting political and cultural contexts. The broader topography of Yazılıkaya includes carved channels that may have guided rainwater into cisterns, an adaptation well suited to the plateau's exposed conditions. But the depth and capacity of these features vary, leaving uncertain whether they were engineered for ritual purification, practical storage, or both. Several rock-cut stairways ascend steep slopes toward isolated platforms, their worn steps indicating frequent passage. Though the absence of structural remains atop these platforms complicates efforts to identify their purpose, and the lack of associated ceramics or votives leaves open whether they served as lookouts, gathering points, or altars whose perishable components have long vanished. Geological studies of the limestone reveal natural fissures and fractures that the Phrygians sometimes incorporated into their carving, yet distinguishing deliberate modification from opportunistic use of natural features remains an ongoing challenge, especially where erosion has blurred the boundaries between carved planes and weathered surfaces. The site's association with the Phrygian kings, particularly the legendary Midas, rests partly on the inscription and partly on stylistic parallels with other Phrygian monumental works. Yet the variability of carving quality and orientation across the plateau suggests contributions from multiple workshops or periods, complicating efforts to assign a single chronological framework to the entire complex. Historical records from later Greek and Roman authors imbue the region with cultural resonance, but these accounts often blend myth and geography in ways that obscure the specific role of Yazılıkaya within the broader Phrygian world, leaving archaeologists to rely primarily on material evidence whose gaps make overarching interpretations tentative. Contradictions also arise when comparing the monument's highly formal facade with the more irregular distribution of surrounding features. For while the facade suggests a major ceremonial focus, the dispersed layout and absence of clear central pathways imply a more fluid ritual landscape in which multiple focal points coexisted without strict architectural hierarchy. The quiet plateau, marked by pockets of juniper and oak, preserves an acoustic stillness that may have been integral to the site's experience. Yet the difficulty of reconstructing ancient soundscapes means that interpretations of how ceremonies unfolded, whether in large gatherings or small household groups, remain speculative. As one moves through the shallow valleys between carved outcrops, the juxtaposition of monumental relief and intimate rock-cut features creates a layered impression of a site that evolved through a combination of deliberate planning and gradual adaptation, shaped by both ceremonial priorities and the pragmatic constraints of the landscape. And in the long intervals where the archaeological record falls silent, where stairways lead to empty platforms, where carved channels end in eroded hollows, where inscriptions fade into the stone, the site holds its meanings in partial suspension, offering enough evidence to trace the outlines of Phrygian ritual and political identity, yet retaining within its weathered surfaces a persistent ambiguity that resists definitive interpretation, leaving Midas city poised between the monumental clarity of its carved facade and the subtler, unresolved questions scattered across the surrounding plateau.